We're beginning a new book today, The Phoenix, an illustrated review of Occultism and Philosophy by the legend Manly P. Hall. And it's even signed by him, too. The legend. Okay, copyright 1931, 1945, and 1956. Old book. As the repositories of a universal sacred learning, the sanctuaries of the pagan gods were protected and served by hierarchies of illumined priests who consecrated to the spirit of truth, labored unceasingly to acquaint evolving humanity with the dual mystery of human origin and destiny. The ancient temples have crumbled away. The holy orders of that day have vanished from the earth. A new priestcraft serves the gods, and a new laity gathers at the clanging of the great bronze bells. The mysteries of antiquity have seemingly perished. The faith, however, of the Golden Age, the first religion of man, can never wholly die. In all its pristine purity, it is preserved even to this day and may be recovered by everyone who will devote his life to the supreme and holy task. It is not decreed that man should be so easily deprived of that which is his own, for even in this generation, which is a stranger to the gods, he who will follow in the footsteps of the neophyte of old may still receive the priceless heritage of truth and light. Amid the bustle and confusion of our great economic era, there are still mystic master builders like Paul and the initiated philosophers like Plato, and these, in common with the priests of an older world, still serve and protect the sacred fires of aspiration burning upon the high altars of humanity. Unrecognized and unappreciated in a generation motivated by personal interest, both these doctrines and their priestly keepers have preserved an inviolable secrecy. The divine traditions still survive, and the wise of one generation still pass on to the wise of the next, that body of mystic truths which is the leaven of civilization and for lack of which mankind must inevitably perish. As we turn the voluminous pages of history, we read in glorious rubricated lettering the record of nations that have passed away, of heroes who lie in unknown and unhonored graves, of conquerors bedecked with the trappings of the mighty and wearing the laurel wreath of victory. Marching down the corridors of time, all these have vanished into a common oblivion. We pause for a moment to pay homage to the grandeur that was Egypt, the magnificence that was Greece, and the glory that was Rome. As upon moldering headstones we read the epitaph of their rise and fall, how each in turn bowed its noble head in the inevitable and went its way. From this graveyard of dead ambitions, we turn to the nations of today, each a proud people, each intoxicated with the power that has brought what we choose to term a measure of success. Yet not one of these nations knows which will be the first to draw the somber robes of its shroud about it and join the ghostly order of peoples that are dead. Like guests at some Borgian feast they sit, with treason in every heart and poison in every cup. Consequently, every historian should be a philosopher, for only the philosopher is able to see the immutability of that universal law by which the actions of men are regulated. There is a destiny which shapes our ends. Causes invisible produce their effects, and these effects in turn, becoming new causes, reap fresh harvests according to their kind. The patience and serenity with which the wise face life sprung from their deeper comprehension of these fundamental issues. The wise can be patient, because that which cannot be wrought in time can be fulfilled in eternity. The discernment of the sage can see beneath the chaos of competitive ethics and the babble of vanity the presence of a divine justice. Though repeatedly outraged, nature is ever sufficient to the achievement of her own ends. One by one the citadels of injustice are stormed by the inevitable and fall. Amid confusion and kaleidoscopic changes stands the immovable one, to whose measureless existence comings and goings are but incidental. He is the pillar envisaged by the Samian sage, which, rising from the depths of space, is the strong support of the universe. The altar of the everlasting one is lifted up in the midst of the world, and upon its flickers throughout all duration the flame of his covenant. If we study the history of vanished races, we will discern the cause of their destruction. When a nation ceases to serve the beautiful, it has already begun to die. When a cause departs from truth, the cause has already failed. When glutted with success and tyrannical with power, like the fabled princes of Atlantis, men no longer love the beautiful and serve the good. They are destroyed by the weight of their own iniquity. We are told in the old writings that black magic overshadowed Egypt, perverted the licentious. The priests served the great specters invoked by their incantations. They called up monsters by their spells and fabricated false gods who were but demons in disguise. The heavenly light upon the temple altars grew fainter and fainter, for truth became less evident as error increased in power. Lust and pride likewise undetermined the solidarity of Greece, and wild debauchery caused the streets of Rome to run with blood and wine. Being but men, the priests of the temples were infected with the common plague and lost the mystic word of power, the name ineffable. Though an almost infinite diversity of creeds has come into manifestation since the primitive doctrine of the first ages, these creeds have all sought to achieve a single end, in other words, the restatement of that primitive revelation which, according to the doctrines of the Kabbalah, was revealed to the patriarchs by the angelic schools. A Hermetic philosopher, writing anonymously in the 16th century, declared his interpretation of the Book of the Seven Seals, that there existed in the heavens above the circles of the earth a university of divine knowledge, a sort of college of celestials. Before his relapsed state, Adam himself had studied in the school of God, and when later he was banished to wander in the corporeal sphere, he was privileged by a benign providence to preserve a faint remembrance of those transcendental doctrines that had been imparted to him by the heavenly host. Having inclined themselves toward material concerns, Adam's descendants became tillers of the field and builders of cities. These natural enterprises established new orders of learning, concerned with the instructions of the material world. The wisdom of God and his hosts and the secrets of spiritual philosophy slowly faded from the conscious mind of the race to remain, however, permanently impressed upon the subconscious intellect. The divine arts and sciences thus came to be forgotten. In their place was erected the structure of the liberal arts, science, and crafts. Thus, upon the footing of worldly wisdom, empire was established. The sages no longer retired into the wilderness to receive the heavenly wisdom with which the messengers of the Most High nourished the hungering soul. In the terms of the same quaint philosopher quoted, but whose name has not been preserved, the angels still attended the celestial schools with appropriate humility and contrition, but men in their pride rejected the divine instruction, were expelled from the university of the elect, and set up a false knowledge upon the earth in defiance of the eternal truth they could no longer comprehend. And let us show you some of the artwork without messing up the pages. Excuse me. Oof. So much symbolism. But this was Zarathustra has returned to his flame. Such traditions, while dubious authenticity, still embodied a germ of truth which, though ridiculed by the sophists, will not be rejected by the scholar. Who can deny that mankind has defied the laws of universal order and sought to set up the supremacy of his own mandates? We have all strayed from the paths of wisdom, as is well witnessed by the mysteries everywhere apparent in moral affairs. Men of more exalted vision than the rest have sensed the real cause of human unhappiness, and in every age the strongest of these have gone forth as reformers, sages, seers, and prophets, seeking to impart the thoughtless world the priceless treasure of understanding. But the path of reformation is hard, and martyrdom is the reward as a deluded world metes out those who would waken it from the coma of its materialism. If we turn to the lives of the great philosophers and sages, we will discover them to be bound together in a common fraternity of purpose. We will furthermore discover that these men were initiates of secret societies, either pagan or Christian, and that their revelations, so called, were but restatements of the sacred doctrines expounded by the mysteries. The Rosicrucian rose was Martin Luther's crest. The Comite de Saint Germain initiated his disciples into the doctrines of the Illuminati and Freemasons in caves along the Rhine. Claude Saint Martin and the unknown philosopher received his light, if we are to believe the authorities, from the Bohemian brothers in the dark fastness of the Black Forest. Then came the divine Cagliostro, defined by Pike as the agent of the Templars, and well called Brother Evans, the Masonic martyr. Over 100 years have passed since Cagliostro languished in the dungeon of St. Leo, but the prejudice which destroyed him still remains. Fleeing from the wrath of enthroned ignorance and living in cellars and garrets, the Hermetic philosophers of the Middle Ages preserved as a sacred trust for a better day those doctrines that have been entrusted to them from remote antiquity. Vilified by such epithets as sorcerer and necromancer, these venerable adepts perpetuated at enormous personal sacrifice the mysteries of the pagan fire philosophy destined by the gods never to pass away. The names of these ancient masters are revered by us today. We are amazed by the powers which they possessed. We bow humbly before their erudition. We are fascinated by the adventures which befell them in the fulfillment of their trust. We marvel at the profundity, yet magnificent simplicity of their beliefs, and almost divine patience with which they tended the flame of philosophy and bore the burden of an afflicting age. Roger Bacon, Nicholas Flamel, Paracelsus, Helvetius, von Helmont, Francis Bacon, Elias Ashmole, Robert Flood, John Haydon, Eugenus Philaethes, and a host of other patrons of the arts and sciences, men of deep learning and wide experience. These illustrious men, as adepts of the magnum opus, look to their more fortunate brothers of this less hazardous century for a fuller measure of accomplishment and devotion. The adepts of the past have come to be regarded as almost mythological personalities whose lives and words, fantastically distorted, have been woven into fairy tales for the amusement of the children of the race. What is the folklore but a history of mysterious happenings which historiographers fear to include in their prosaic records of a people? Yet, in spite of a definite and almost untiring effort to obliterate from the memory of the world everything pertaining the mystery of magic or the super sciences, the ghosts of the ancient thaumaturgists cling tenaciously to the substance of our imaginations. We are obsessed by these elder spirits. They refuse to be forgotten. They demand their due for their very life, for their very work's sake. And in spite of ourselves, we not only remember them, but also the broad measure of their accomplishments. We shudder even in the smugness of our materiality when we realize that our present civilization rests upon the broad shoulders of demigods and heroes half divine, even as the substance of our history is established upon the ephemerality of myth and legend. And so we stand together in all splendor of our various discomfitures, miserably educated, distressingly cultured, oblivious to all that is essential to right living, and painfully ignorant of those vital essentials which only the philosophic insight can reveal. Each of us is a 20th century Faust. Goethe's heroes speak for each of us in the immortal lines, and here I stand with all my lore, a fool no wiser than before. The Mysteries of the Holy Grail. Artwork. Big book. Why must we continually reject those sublime truths proffered to us out of the past? Why do we turn our backs with scorn upon those splendid doctrines of other ages, declaring only the present to be real and the past but idle superstition? When Plato affirms the inner mysteries of life, what modern upstart in his shadowness dares to refute him? When Cicero bears witness to the efficacy of the mysteries, who of this generation is qualified to say him nay? When the superlative intellects of all ages have united in a common adoration of the secret doctrine, revering above all other men those initiated into its mysteries, how can we, in the vanity of our own conceits, ridicule our superiors, and then go on living worse than the men we scoff at? Is it fitting that we should honor those illumined intellection has bought wisdom out of the obscurity of the first ages, and preserved the unbroken chain of philosophic tradition through all the vicissitudes of changing time? Nor should we honor them by words alone, but rather by so living and serving the great truths of life, that sacrifices of the first philosopher should not be in vain. There is but one appropriate propitiation, one acceptable offering, and that is right use. These seers and sages of antiquity established the institutions in which the mysteries of philosophy were revealed. They demonstrated to mankind the true way of pertainment achievement. They led the neophytes to the gateway of the intellectual sphere where truth dwells in the midst of the wise. After sojourning with humanity for their allotted span, these ministers of the sovereign good closely drew their robes of gold about them and passed into the inner sanctuary, the adytum of the everlasting house from which none cometh out again. They not only taught, because they were adepts, they lived their doctrines, and they lived as well as their words reveal the fullness of their understanding. The dying Buddha declared to his disciples that he left behind 3 jewels, and that through contemplation of them all might achieve to the supreme blessedness. These heavenly gems, radiant with an indwelling splendor, were the life of the Buddha, the word of the Buddha, and the order of the Buddha. While these jewels continue upon the earth, the monk in his saffron robe shall not be left without hope of achievement. The Buddha established the way, and in his footsteps millions have walked the path of attainment. The Buddha has entered his nirvana. The Christ has departed to his Father. Zoroaster has returned to his flame. They have all gone to his own end as determined by his works, but their accomplishments endure. They were wise in their truest sense of that world. They were builders of a divine house, architects of lasting civilization, artisans skilled beyond all other men. Time may pass away, history be swallowed up in eternity, nations crumble, the world itself vanish into the flame from whence it came. But if there be anything that will endure the conflagration which marks the boundary of duration, it is understanding. If any man have hope, understanding is the substance of that hope. If there be immorality, understanding renders its achievement possible. Perfection of understanding is ultimate perfection. Understanding is eternal, incapable of destruction or change. Therefore these masters of understanding will never cease to be, but as 49 flames will gather as a blazing aureole about the sovereign fire which burns forever. Invoke by your contemplation the shadows of the master builders who have gone before. In your dream behold the marching conquerors passing triumphantly down the royal arches of time. There is the dark-skinned Orpheus, his face illumined with a radiant ecstasy as he draws from the 7-stringed lyre symbolic of the harmony of his own being, the measurelessness harmonies of the spheres. Beside him is the Egyptian Hermes, the thrice greatest, the beloved son of wisdom, bearing in one hand the caduceus, whose warring serpents have ceased to struggle, and holding aloft in the other hand the glistening and gleaming emerald tablet bearing the revelation of the immutable law. In this vision out of the past behold dimly the blue Krishna, the beloved child of the flute and the conch shell, who on the battlefield of Kurukshetra leaned from his heavenly chariot and delivered to Arjuna, prince of men, the Bhagavad Gita, the song of the ever-living Lord. Behind Krishna and learning on an iron-bound staff stands the sublime Buddha, with yellow robe and shaven head, Lord of humility and the perfect way, Asia's light, and the giver of the good law. Behind Gautama stalks grave Pythagoras, his head bent over his long beard upon his breast. There is also a Syrian master, Jesus, his brow serene with the calm of self-mastery, but his face saddened by the sins committed in his name. His shade appears for an instant and is gone again. After him come a host of others. Confucius, the sage of China, walks side by side with Lao Tzu, the mystic of Tao, and the perfect way. Great thundering Odin follows, holding high Gungnir, the spear cut from the branches of the tree of life, and high is flung the black banner of Mohammed, planted by him in the courtyard of the Kaaba. After he had overthrown the 360 idols and reconsecrated Mecca to the living God, far at the unknown beginning is the half-distinguishable specter of Zoroaster, lying with the spear wound in his back, and Moses, the strong man of Israel, alone in death upon the dreary hill of Moab. The line is endless. These masters of other days, they were men above creed and clan, nobler than those distinctions with which we separate the common aspirations of humanity. They served not idols, but ideals. Theologies grew up about them, yet each was greater than the order which he founded. From the same place they all came forth. The spirit of their doctrines was identical, and each finally mingled his own smaller self with common accomplishment. Among the great teachers of humanity, there was neither superiority nor inferiority. There was simply difference, not difference of purpose, but of method, not divergence of end, but of way. Hand in hand they marched down the ages. Each revered the other, for all true greatness loves greatness, and only littleness hates. That same overshadowing consciousness that had made them truly great had revealed to them not only the brotherhood of all life, but, more than this, the identity of all life. As never before, the secret doctrines of the ancients intrigued the philosophically minded. The insufficient creeds and dogmas that survived the Renaissance are fast crumbling before the crushing force of rationalism, and men who were once of different faiths are now united in the common quest of a more reasonable code of living. Through the objects of his veneration may change, man remains essentially a religious animal. He may break away from the limitations and futilities of ecclesiastical schisms, but he cannot escape from the inherent urge to venerate his Creator, ever surrounded by irrefutable evidence of an abiding destiny. The thinking man is powerless to resist that dominating impulse to appropriate in some other appropriate manner the mysterious spirit abiding in the furthermost and the innermost. Throughout the first ages of humanity, certain divinely instituted mysteries were the intermediaries between man and his Maker. These august institutions were the custodians of a superior learning by which the human mind was inclined toward the way of truth and understanding. But as nations verged towards materialism and the peoples of earth ceased to venerate the sovereign good, so these sacred schools gradually became corrupted. Those which through compromise escaped utter annihilation remained as perverse spirits to impede the very progress which they had once sponsored. Politically, we are disillusioned as to the divine right of temporal monarchs, and ecclesiastically as to the apostolic succession of the spiritual elect. Thus disheartened by the sophistry of an unenlightened age, we turn from vagaries to renew our endless search for the substance of truth. We would follow in the footsteps of those prophets of earlier days, who, ascending the mountain tops of wisdom, beheld their Makers face to face in the midst of lightnings, and heard the deep rumble of his voice even above the far-flung echoes of the thunder. In his rocky cavern upon the slopes of Mount Hira, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, prayed that the pure religion of the first patriarchs might again be revealed to a humanity bowed down in sackcloth and ashes by the weight of numberless afflictions. The strong man of Arabia stretched forth his arms into the darkness and pled with the night that the wisdom which abides in space might come forth to lead men from idolatry back to the worship of the one God who is Spirit, and who must be served in spirit and in truth. Too long have we wandered in the vale of shadows, groveling before phantoms of our own creation, and worshipping ghosts and specters. Too long have we been afraid to lift our eyes to the radiant countenance of our Creator, lest we be blinded by the awful light of truth. Too long have we prostrated ourselves abjectly to the feet of gilded men, bestowing upon mortals that homage reserved for the gods alone. Too long has the shortness of our vision made gods of men and men of gods. The darkest pages of history are those upon which are traced the records of the faiths of men. In the great march of nations and beliefs, death has ever ridden in the vanguard, losing upon the earth the horrors described by Milton. Men have sung their hymns of hate, and in their hearts they have tired of gory splendor. Enough of the God who marches with the arms of ambition and stands upon the battlefield surrounded by the bodies of the slain. A disillusioned humanity, weary of its own mistakes, turns again in despair to the mysterious emptiness about it, an emptiness which seems to be the abiding place of a mighty spirit. In all this panorama of confusion and error, space alone seems capable of Gentile comprehension. In extremities such as now confront mankind, the ages have demonstrated that it is natural for the more serious-minded individual to depart from commerce and industry and turn to philosophy. Verging from material possessions, he inclines his mind to all-satisfying reason. There is scant solace in our dusats when the real issues of life are at stake. The wise man knows that the glamour of so-called fortune but complicates the many uncertainties of temporal affairs. There is much of pathos in the envy which we gaze upon the placid fate of the sage. How is it that but a few achieve to the composure of the wise, while utter misery is the lot of the many? What is the essence of that mysterious learning which not only enables man to discover peace, but also endows him with such surpassing attributes that we are prone to accredit him with qualities but little inferior to a god? But what procedure is that wisdom acquired which not only reveals the end to which all natures are being swept by an irresistible destiny, but also transfigures the human soul which the light of all pervading good? There is a science, real to a few and mythical to many, preserved from a remote age from him who has become what John Haydon the Rosicrucian calls a servant of God and a secretary of nature. In an Egyptian ritual, the Book of the Master, it is written that ultimately death is swallowed up in light, and through the disciplines of philosophy, humanity can be caused to rise, phoenix-like, from the dead ashes of materiality to mingle its lesser mind with the eternal reason. The elements of such an accomplishment constitute the natural religion of man, that unwritten doctrine which has ever been the spiritual bread of the wise, and if man will partake thereof, he will never hunger again. And that's our introduction to the Phoenix, Manly P. Hall.